Hey, everybody. It says I'm live, so I'm going to try to trust the computer that that is correct, that we're live here on Friday, April 24th. Hi, everybody. It's Tony. And this is episode 5 of Brush Up Your Shakespeare. Can you believe that 5 episodes in here? That means 5 weeks or more into our kind of new reality. I hope everybody's well out there at episode 5. Who knows? Before you know it, we'll have enough for syndication. This is a very special episode today of Brush Up Your Shakespeare, like those 70s sitcoms used to have those special episodes, and they'd shut the laugh track off and they'd do it in black and white or something like that, and they'd have some kind of moral tale to tell us. We're not going to do any of that today. No moral tales or anything. We're just going to be talking about Shakespeare's language. But it is special because it's Shakespeare's birthday, or at least was yesterday. And John already is coming in and saying, "Woohoo! Happy birthday, Bill S. 456 years young." That's right. 456 years ago yesterday, he was born. And like so many kind of facts about Shakespeare, which we have, for someone so famous from his writing, which is the way it should be, we have very little to know of his biography. We'll talk a little bit about that today. And if you have any questions about Shakespeare's life that I could possibly answer, I'll certainly try to. And if you have a favorite quote or passage that you'd like to kind of talk about today, please send it to me here. Gail says he's looking very festive. There he is. So say happy birthday to him. I've even got a little cake here with a kind of prop light that with candlelight, because I couldn't find any birthday candles. That's how kind of DIY we're doing here right now. But this little kind of apple strudely thing, which I will eat in his honor later today. So we'll sing happy birthday, or you can sing happy birthday to yourself at home. If I could lead a Zoom chorus, I would, but no one wants to hear me sing happy birthday solo. So I'm not going to do that. But 456 years ago yesterday, Shakespeare was born. And as I was saying, like so many facts in Shakespeare's life, that one's even a little questionable in that we know as he was baptized. His baptism was recorded, I believe, on the 25th of September or 26th of September in at 26th, I believe, in April of 1564. Kind of the conventional wisdom, and the scholars and everybody got together and said, well, we'll just call it that he probably was born on the 23rd. It was usually baptisms happened a couple of 3 days after babies were born, and recorded in the register there at the church in Stratford. So we just say he was born on April 23rd. He died on April 23rd, and that kind of is a cool kind of round, little life rounded with a sleep. In this case, on the same date, he lived to be 52 years old. So let's say happy birthday again to Bill. How you doing? Happy birthday! And why are we celebrating this guy? 456 years. There aren't many people we kind of every year have a big day, or we say, oh, guess what today is? It's Shakespeare's birthday, over 4.5 centuries after he was writing. And there are a lot of reasons for that, which we're going to talk about today. So please, if you will. Anne says, I sent in a quote last night by email. I hope you got it. And I didn't get it. It didn't go into my thing. I checked it just before I came on, or I didn't see it. So if you could send at least there on the side here, you type a little bit of it in and I'll find it and we'll chat about it. So Anne, please get that to me. I have a couple of things down that I got, but anyway, you got your chat. So Anne, if you could give me a little bit, and we'll look that up. Excuse me, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So why are we still kind of talking about Shakespeare all of these years later, 456 years later? Why is his influence? Excuse me. This has nothing to do with coronavirus. I think there's a lot of pollen in the air lately, and it's a little dry in here. So forgive that cough. Don't get scared, and of course, nothing is transmittable here through And by all means, don't use any disinfectant internally, no matter what our esteemed kind of leaders try to tell us. All right. I wanted to start with this great quote. This is a great book, Soul of the Age by Jonathan Shakespeare, by the numbers. Okay. What did he do? 1564 to 1616. That's 52 years. 37, maybe 38, maybe 40 plays. The way that some kind of scholars are always contesting. Maybe he wrote this, maybe he didn't write that, but that's a lot of plays. 154 sonnets. You probably read, the most famous, of course, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day? You read them at your weddings all the time, things like that. 154 sonnets, 5 or 6, depending, again, how these big poems, Venus and Adonis, The Rape of Lucrece, etc. Scholars kind of go back and forth about how many words they think Shakespeare invented, or at least used in a different form of speech or in a different way. 1,700, maybe. Sometimes people say 2,000. Sometimes people say as many as 3,500 new words Shakespeare used in his vocabulary, at least in the plays, plays. There are 28,000 different words or so in his plays that are used. And if you kind of compare that to the, most of us, scholars tell us that we kind of probably use 7,500 to 10,000 words in our own vocabularies. So his vocabulary was immense. It was constantly changing. He was constantly transforming it himself. We'll go through some of the words that we say that he invented or kind of used or popularized. Words like addiction, assassination, bubble, courtship, eyeball, luggage, impartial, swagger, tranquil. All these kind of words that we use today often appear for the first time in his plays. Now, that being said, sometimes it wasn't necessarily something that Shakespeare invented, but because of the popularity of his work and the way he used the word, they come down to us through them, and those kind of he popularized them or put them in a way that we continue to use them today. And I'll give some more examples of that. What else do we know about Shakespeare by the numbers? A lot of deaths in his plays. This is really interesting. I found this out. There are 100 deaths, which I actually thought was low when I thought about it. I thought there would be more than that, but 100 deaths throughout his plays. Here's how people die in his plays: 52 people were stabbed. 4 were poisoned. 3 were both stabbed and poisoned. 2 baked in a pie, of course, in Titus Andronicus, and 2 hanged. 1 pursued and eaten by a bear. Now, those of you who have been coming to the GAM for a while know The Winter's Tale. We did that a couple years ago. Great Richard Donnelly played Antigonus, who saves the baby's life, and then the bear comes, going to eat the baby, and Antigonus says, "Eat me instead," and the bear chases Antigonus off and rips him to shreds off stage. And it is the most famous stage direction probably in the history of the theater, which is Exit Pursued by Bear. Which is, of course, popularized also in Hanna-Barbera cartoons in the 60s and 70s by Snagglepuss, who used to love to say "exit stage left" with that kind of Bert Lahr voice, pursued by bear, even, I believe he said once. I was actually looking for a clip and I couldn't find it, but in my brain somehow that registers as a kid going, what did he mean by that? I never understood, and then years later knowing pursued by bear. So again, even Snagglepuss, even Hanna-Barbera were always quoting Shakespeare. So what do we got here? Heidi says, "Take him and cut him out in little stars, and he will make the face of heaven so fine that all the world will be in love with night." That's a beautiful one, Heidi. One of the most famous passages, of course. If you don't recognize that one, you probably could guess it's Juliet talking about Romeo in Romeo and Juliet, which we talked about the balcony scene a couple of weeks ago. That's such a beautiful, beautiful image, right? That keeps coming back in that play. Take him and cut him out in little stars, and he will make the face of heaven so fine that all the world will be in love with night. Thank you. Thank you, Peter Michael. Even now, very now, an old black ram is tupping your white ewe. Yeah, that's a vicious one, Peter. You've got a taste for the kind of dark there, right? That's, of course, Othello and the kind of racist invective that is used in order to kind of persecute him in that play very, very powerfully at the top of that play. Caroline says, "Then let them use us well, else let them know the ills we do, their ills instruct us so." And that's Amelia from the same play from Othello towards the end when she's talking about how men treat women in a very, very famous speech. If you've never read that, you check that out. That's in a scene with when she tries to convince Desdemona, of course, to kind of come to her senses in a sense and realize what's happening around her and what's going on with Othello. And who I asked to get back in says, "My mother used to chastise me and my 2 sisters with how sharper than a serpent's tooth it is to have a thankless child," right? Yeah, and her voice was ever soft, gentle, and low, an excellent thing in a woman. I'm sure your mother's voice wasn't soft, gentle, and low, an excellent thing in a woman when she was saying that to you. Of course, that's King Lear talking about his daughters, and then your mom kind of telling you, "Don't be like that, be nice to me." And mothers could use Shakespeare, of course, to kind of keep their children in line. And Phyllis says, "Of course, Richard, I remember that," or "That's Richard, I remember that exit pursued by a bear." Yeah. It's what else we got here? These are coming in fast and quick. It's something about that very, very now that makes it very nasty. Yes, Peter's talking back to the Othello thing. Yeah, he says, "That's great. We should take a look at that." He says, "Even now, very now." Right? An old black ram is tupping your white ewe. That's even now, very now. Isn't that a great construction? Now, and then we get to a third, and he always goes up in that in now, very now. Strong stresses, making that immediacy and shocking us with the brutality of that language and the hate and the invective in it. All these things we talk about, these beautiful things, but there's a lot of ugly speech, of course, in Shakespeare as well, because that's who we are as people, and he was mapping the entirety of human consciousness. So keep them coming, keep them coming, keep them coming. So back to the numbers a little bit. That pursued by bear, I said that love is used in his plays. The word love comes 1,640 times, which triumphs hate, which is only 163 times. So there's 10 times more love than hate in Shakespeare, and that's a good thing to remember in these times. Death is said a lot of displays about death. 781 times that word comes up, as opposed to 681 times where we hear the word God. What else do we know about Shakespeare? Well, we talk about all the time. For 456 years, he's the most produced playwright in the world, right? 456 years old. Um, there's been average of, and they say in the second half of the 20th century, the beginning of the 21st century, an average of 410 professional productions of Shakespeare per year. As far out goes any playwright. Now, part of that is not only are plays brilliant, but of course we don't have to pay any rights to Shakespeare. If this guy was getting still collecting royalties, or his descendants were still collecting royalties, they'd be in like kind of Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates land, and at least they would have earned it off of art, right? 410 professional productions a year. I would venture to guess, I don't know this offhand, but I would say 10 times that in terms of non-professional and student productions. Amateur and student productions of Shakespeare, of course, abound all over the place, and far outnumber those. So you're talking thousands of productions of Shakespeare's plays a year. It's being played constantly around the globe in almost every language spoken around the globe, and certainly on every continent, maybe save Antarctica, but everywhere, um, uh, in constant motion and coming back to him. He has, this was interesting to find out, 1,151 IMDb credits, Shakespeare. There's dozens and dozens of film adaptations and television adaptations, of course. And if you go on IMDb, he actually has 1,151 credits as credited as like helping to write or inspired by the screenplay or co-writer or whatever it might be. What else do we have? Oh, for a muse of fire. This is from Jason. Oh, for a muse of fire that would ascend the brightest heaven of invention. What is his favorite quote? We talked about that. That's the opening of Henry V, was such a um, beautiful invocation to say, we don't have, we don't have a muse. We can't kind of, make this happen and kind of invent this. The gods can't throw this down. We poor humans have to do this. I wish I had it, and we're going to do our best in our imagination to approximate that. It's such an incredible way to start a play. So that's a kind of couple of things by the numbers. There's some more facts about him that are really interesting, but all of these, everyone's throwing in their favorite quotes and what they love about Shakespeare. And the fact is, we're quoting him all the time, even if we don't know it. Even if we think we've never read a Shakespeare play, and you have your friends or relatives out there and go, "That's Shakespeare. I don't understand that. I hate it." And of course, we talk about why we're doing this in the first place. And I'm trying to prove that even if you think you hate Shakespeare or you don't like him, that he's kind of there in you, in the way you speak, in the way you communicate, in the way you kind of perceive human behavior, etc. There's this great thing that you may have seen, that's been around for a long time, that Bernard Levin put together, which is you can see it on a poster, sometimes it's on a t-shirt, about quoting Shakespeare, how often we're quoting Shakespeare. So I wanted to kind of run through that quickly, just so you get an idea of some of the things that you may have forgotten about that you've said a zillion times. And then I also went and found where each of these quotes are from. I just couldn't do that off the top of my head. And they're from all over the plays and the sonnets, etc. But these are things that we hear every day in our life. And it's just a partial list that we're going to start with. Quoting Shakespeare with thanks to Bernard Levin. He says, "If you cannot understand my argument and declare it's Greek to me, you are quoting Shakespeare, specifically Julius Caesar. If you claim to be more sinned against than sinning, you are quoting King Lear. If you act more in sorrow than in anger, Hamlet. If your wish is father to the thought, that's Henry IV, Part 2. If your property has vanished into thin air, The Tempest. If you have ever refused to budge an inch, that's Taming of the Shrew, or suffered from green-eyed jealousy, Othello. If you have played fast and loose, that's from King John, a play that probably none of us have read. If you have been tongue-tied, that's from Sonnet 85. If you are a tower of strength, Richard III. If you've been hoodwinked, Romeo and Juliet. Or in a pickle, that's from The Tempest. If you have knitted your brows, Henry VI, Part 2. If you have made a virtue of necessity, that's Two Gentlemen of Verona. If you've insisted on fair play, The Tempest. If you slept not one wink, that's Cymbeline. If you stood on ceremony, Julius Caesar. Laughed yourself into stitches, Twelfth Night. Had short shrift, Richard III. Or cold comfort, that's from Taming of the Shrew. Or too much of a good thing, As You Like It. If you've lived in a fool's paradise, Romeo and Juliet. Why, be that as it may, As You Like It. The more fool you, Taming of the Shrew. For it is a foregone conclusion, Othello, that you are, as luck would have it, merry wives, quoting Shakespeare. If you think it is high time, you're quoting Comedy of Errors. And that is the long and the short of it. That's Merry Wives. If you believe that the game is up, Cymbeline, or that the truth will out, Merchant of Venice, even if it involves your own flesh and blood, that's a lot of plays. If you lie low, much ado, till the crack of doom, Macbeth, because you suspect foul play. That's a lot of plays too. If you have set your teeth on edge, that's Henry IV, Part One. At one fell swoop, Macbeth, without rhyme or reason, comedy of errors. Then, to give the devil his due, Henry VI, if the truth were known, Winter's Tale, for surely you have a tongue in your head. The Tempest, you are quoting Shakespeare. Even if you bid me, good riddance. Troilus and Cressida. And send me packing, Henry VI, Part Two. If you wish I were dead as a doornail, Henry VI, Part One. If you think I'm a laughing stock, Merry Wives of Windsor. Or the devil incarnate, Titus Andronicus. If you think I'm bloody minded, Henry VI, Part Three. Or a blinking idiot, right? Merchant of Venice. Then by Jove, oh Lord, tut tut, for goodness sakes, that's many, many plays. What the dickens, Merry Wives of Windsor. It is all one to me. Twelfth Night, you are quoting Shakespeare. So that's a lot of quoting Shakespeare. And that's just the kind of, again, the tip of the iceberg. So I'm looking over here for what we got, passing through nature to eternity. Oh, just beautiful. Yes, there's another one. Passing through nature to eternity is something we've heard before too, right? I think that I'm pretty sure that's Hamlet. What else do we have? Chuck says, "I'll slit the villain's nose that would have sent me to the jail," which has been Vincentio from Taming of the Shrew. Yeah, which is the father that comes in, and that's a great way. Slit the villain's nose, and we know what that is. If you've ever seen the movie Chinatown, Roman Polanski film, who made a great film of Macbeth. And it's got a very complicated figure in the world, but he directed that film, and he actually plays the guy who slits Jack Nicholson's nose. I'll slit the villain's nose, which was a common kind of way of going at them and punishing so that they could see the scar. Isn't that kind of brutal? Again, a lot of ugly in these plays. Yeah. Stephanie adds, I have always loved Prospero's passage that begins, ye elves of brooks, standing lakes and groves. Yes, of course, Prospero has, many, many, many kind of monologues where he comes out. Of course, probably the most famous of which is where he says, we are the stuff that dreams are made on, right? And our little life is rounded with a sleep. Dreams are made on. That's Prospero as well. And oh, wait a minute. Look, Audrey was right after that. And she says that we are such stuff as dreams are made on. Yeah. From Richard, to me, fair friend, you never can be old. For as you were when you first your eye I eyed, such your beauty still. To me, fair friend, you never can be old. For as you were when first your eye I eyed, such your beauty still. Yeah, isn't that beautiful? Sounds, it's something that probably adorns many an anniversary card between long married couples, right? I can think of nothing beautiful more to say to someone you've loved your entire life than that. Wild Goose Chase is another one, right? That's Caroline throws that at us. That's right from Romeo and Juliet, right? Another thing that we kind of say all the time. If you prick us, we do not bleed. Yeah, of course, from Merchant of Venice and Shylock's favorite speech. If I be waspish, best beware my sting. Right. Yeah, isn't that great? These keep coming. There's so many of these. So please, please keep them coming and we'll talk more about them. There's a couple longer passages I'd like to talk about in a minute. But speaking of Wild Goose Chase, here's some more. Pure as the driven snow. If you've seen their days, that's from As You Like It. Forever in a Day is As You Like It. Good Riddance, Troilus and Cressida. We already talked about that one. Cruel to be Kind, right? Not just an Elvis song. Hamlet. Love is Blind is from The Merchant of Venice. Be All and the End All, which is from Macbeth. Break the Ice. Heart of Gold, that's from Shrew. And then Henry V. Kill with Kindness, Taming of the Shrew. Even Knock Knock, Who's There, right? Comes right out of Macbeth with the porter scene, yeah? All the Live Long Day, Julius Caesar, The Game's Afoot, etc. That's Henry V. These are on and on and on and on and on. It's an amazing kind of compendium of kind of things that have just become. There's an old joke about Hamlet that, oh, I think I know that play. Someone says, isn't that just that one with all the cliches are strung together, right? Because when you're in that play alone, we haven't even got to some of that stuff. You're just hearing things that constantly have come in to our parlance, our everyday speech. And again, this is something that we ought to think about when we think we're afraid of him. Why are we afraid of someone who we're actually quoting more than any other writer that we could possibly think of? Yeah. Gail sends in, live a little, comfort a little, cheer thyself a little, is deceptively simple, sums up our duty to ourselves and others. Cheer thyself in modern translation might be do self-care. Right now, yeah, there's so much of this that we're looking for as we're sitting in these as we talk about difficult and unprecedented times, which are probably overused words, but they're certainly true in the moment. Self quarantine, isolation, all of these things. What does the consolation of great literature and great art is often in kind of looking into the interior of ourselves and examining who we are, and live a little, comfort a little, cheer thyself a little. Yeah, though deceptively simple, but at these times, not just to make turn it into a kind of easy self-help thing that's going to kind of cure all, but there are ways of seeing, right? The literature, and Shakespeare in particular, offers us complex ways of looking at ourselves, and not just things that we would put on a. Oftentimes we see a lot of these quotes on T-shirts or on bumper stickers on a car, or crocheted into your favorite pillow, and they seem sweet and anodyne and saccharine. And often they're much more than that. And sometimes it's nice to find them and then to put them back into context of what the character is saying, so that when sometimes we pull things out of context, they don't have the same power, or they have a very different power, and it actually changes their meaning. So also, if you're interested, and which is why I went through that long list and said, hey, this is what this is from, and this is what this is from, and this is what this is from, is you should go back and check them out. And when you hear them, they bring on they'll within the context of the play versus just pulled out of the play. All of a sudden, they take on something else, right? They mean something. We can go further. We can study and look deeper. And Shakespeare's always offering us that. So check these things out. I mean, if anybody has a question about any of those, where did you find that? Let me know, and I will certainly give you that reference. Caroline asked, do you think malapropism is lost on a modern audience? Malapropism. I don't know. We use malaprops are interesting. A malaprop, of course, is often using one word in one context that means something we don't think it means. We often are mistaking words for their opposite meanings oftentimes, and that can be really, really funny. There's a character in a great restoration comedy by Richard Brinsley Sheridan called The Rivals, whose name is Mrs. Malaprop, and it's all she does is speak in malapropisms. And it's very funny. I think it's the funniest character in the play. And of course, Chuck, who was in earlier and talking, sent in a quote. Was in a production that we did a few years ago of Much Ado About Nothing, which we've done a couple of times. And the famous use of malaprops in that is, of course, Dogberry, who's the constable character, kind of one of the clowns, and the cop on the beat, and is always using the wrong word to say what he means. But doing so, somehow getting his meaning across anyway, and of course making the audience roar with laughter. Knock knock is just before the first line of Hamlet. Yeah, that's it, isn't it? Right, the first line of Hamlet, of course, is the greatest line. I think Christopher Walken was asked this on one of that actor studio show. What's your favorite line in the play? And he said the opening line of Hamlet, which is "Who's there?" I think Francisco, one of the sentinels, says, "Who's there?" He hears something. And it's an amazing way to start the play because, of course, after you say who's there, anybody could answer, anything could answer, and so that's could talk about a kind of all possibility. But it is, yeah, that's a punchline of the joke, right? So if we hear a knock knock, maybe it's on the door to the castle, etc. Then who's there? Becomes the punchline. That's where I don't know if that's where we get knock knock jokes on, but why not attribute it to Shakespeare? Sometimes we attribute everything else to him. Now, it is also important to know that in all of the stuff where we say sometimes there's a tendency to kind of give him more the devil his due, for instance, right? We said that that's not exactly a Shakespeare thing. That was probably common parlance and had gone back before him. His plays have popularized some of these things, so things that were even in use before he started using them come to us through it because they survived in his plays, right? Now, he wrote 37, 38, 40, depending on what people, again, as we talked about in the Shakespeare by the numbers section here at the top. If he wrote, and that's kind of the corpus of his work that survives, and that kind of comes down to us, and because we do them so often and they're repeated so often, they have such a big part in our lives. That's a lot. That they say in his plays is almost 900,000 words. The longest play he wrote, of course, is Hamlet at 4,024 lines. And then I think the shortest play is Comedy of Errors, which is like 1,750, which is less than half the length. Most of the plays average in around the high 2,000 mark. So they're that you're talking over 3 hours of playing time for them all. And Hamlet is famously, if you do it uncut, which almost nobody ever does anymore, is a 4-hour production. I would recommend, you don't get to, because you never get to see it that often, Kenneth Branagh's 1990 seven, I believe, or 1998 film of Hamlet is uncut in 4 hours. And in this time of quarantine and self-isolation, you got some time on your hands to kind of indulge something. Everybody's watching series now. Everyone's kind of going deep. I want to binge something. Well, you could binge Hamlet. Consider it four 1 hour long episodes of the greatest play ever written. And you get to hear every word, which is, of course, almost never done on stage. You usually go to see Hamlet, you get to 2.5 to 3 hour mark. Anything less than that, and you're probably not really doing the play that much justice. But rarely do you get to see every word of it, which is and really beautifully filmed with an incredible cast. So that's my kind of Shakespeare recommendation, and his 456th birthday. But there's a lot of other stuff out there too. There's actually a recent film that's called The King, which would be an interesting thing for everybody to watch based on if you've been kind of tuning into these, especially last week when we were talking about Henry V. It's on Netflix. It's streamable, and it's a film about Henry V and Falstaff, etc., and the story that Shakespeare popularized in his history plays. But it's done, even though it follows some of the bones of Shakespeare's plotting of it. It actually it uses modern language in it. And so when you kind of get to sections that if you know from Shakespeare, I'd be interested to hear what you think of how that language comes in. So please continue to send in any of your favorite lines, and we'll talk about them. Now we've talked about his influence on our language in terms of the things that we kind of repeat, even if we don't know it, things that have become kind of cliche in our lives in the way of, talking to each other. So many hundreds of phrases and words, etc. We haven't even really talked about famous lines in Shakespeare, just things that we don't repeat, except that we know as among the most famous lines of literature. So I compiled a few of these, and this is again just the tip of the iceberg. Here's a couple that you may know. Of course, we've talked about this one in our very first episode: "To be or not to be." That is the question. That is a very, very famous line. Again, something that someone would know even if they had never read the play Hamlet. "All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players." That's of course from "As You Like It," Jaques' famous speech in the Seven Ages of Man, probably maybe the most famous soliloquy after "To Be or Not to Be." Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? Of course, we talked about that in the second week. The first thing we do, this one you might not recognize, you'll recognize the phrase, but you might not recognize where it's from. The first thing we do is kill all the lawyers, is actually a Shakespeare line, exactly quoted as that. Dick the Butcher character in Henry VI, Part 2, in the beginning of a rebellion. The first thing we do is kill all the lawyers. Now is the winter of our discontent, of course, from Richard III. Is this a dagger before me, right? Or which I see before me, the handle toward my hand, that's Macbeth. Some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them. That's from Malvolio in Twelfth Night. Cowards die many times before their death. The valiant never taste of death but once. From Julius Caesar. Full fathom 5, thy father lies. Yes, from The Tempest. How sharper than a serpent's tooth it is to have a thankless child. We talked about that. That's from King Lear. Frailty, thy name is woman. Hamlet at his lowest, yeah, or close to his lowest. If you prick us, as we heard earlier, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge? Of course, Shylock, Merchant of Venice. I am one who loved not wisely, but too well. Othello, the lady doth protest too much, methinks. Hamlet, we are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with the sleep we talked about from The Tempest. Our episode 2 weeks ago, our third episode, we talked about Macbeth. Life is but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Right? That's of course from Macbeth. Peter writes in, I love Hamlet, but I'm partial to King Lear. I think Hamlet is the greatest play, but King Lear is the greater attempt at expressing the human condition, even if it doesn't live up to his own thoughts. I'm going to actually talk a bit about King Lear towards the end of this, and something we'll explore later down the road. I kind of, agree with your general premise, actually, Peter. I think Hamlet, yeah, Hamlet is, and maybe it's just an age thing. And maybe as we crawl towards, closer to Lear's experience in life, that becomes the more powerful play. But I do think it's his most moving play. Yes. I think Hamlet may be the greatest play ever written. And there's a lot. What does it mean by great? We could talk on for hours about that. But no play moves me like King Lear does. Lear's plight in particular. We're going to talk a little bit about the end. Kelly last week asked what was my favorite one of my favorite quotes or a favorite quote from Shakespeare. And when I was thinking about it, the Lear kept coming back to me. So I pulled a couple, and I'm going to talk about those towards the end because they're the most moving. When I think about the things of why what I get out of art, what I get out of theater and literature is is how much it moves me. Um, and Lear certainly does that in its expression, as you could point out, of the human condition. And we'll talk about why the rawness that he gets to, the level of pain, the level of suffering, he is extraordinary, and the connection, the recognition that we have when Lear has his recognition, and we'll talk more about that. So thank you for bringing that up. Isabel asks, when directing, how do you go about making cuts and or changing lines? Do you ever add words to complete the meter? If you cut before a line finishes, how do you best keep the integrity of the text? That's a great question, Isabel. Um, Yes, we always edit Shakespeare. Shakespeare is almost never done, as I talked about earlier with Hamlet, it's almost never done uncut because the first reason is because they're very long. And they tend to be over the 3 hour mark if they're played uncut. Modern audiences are different than his audiences, and we listen in a different way. And it's not just that our attention spans are different, and it's because I don't want to make it a moral judgment that, oh, well, so we don't have the attention span for it anymore. Um, but he was painting with words in a way that we can do visually, maybe a little bit better than he was able to in his day, with our sets and with our costumes and other kinds of ways of producing his plays than the way he kind of did them, or his company did. So that's the first reason. So we always edit, and I think there are a lot of people who do change Shakespeare occasionally, and when they come across a particularly thorny passage in his work that is just not going to play to an audience. And so sometimes we get rid of those, or we try to restructure them. Should we be changing words in Shakespeare? I tend to I would say to stay away from that if possible. I will say honestly that sometimes word change may be helpful as long as you think about using a word that stays within the meter of Shakespeare, meaning especially if it's a verse line, that it retains the integrity of the line. So you want to look for a word that can replace it, but also is a word that Shakespeare would use in the same um, context. So you do your research through his plays and say he used to express that thought. He's also used this word here, and maybe that's a little clearer. So I wouldn't try to overdo that because sometimes we underestimate the audience's intelligence of going with something and staying with Shakespeare's intention. But if you are to change anything, I think if you stick within kind of his world and look to something that he would have replaced or he would have used in the same situation, a Shakespearean word that makes sense, then you can sometimes kind of manage to do that. Being judicious and integrity is everything. I would so it's a slippery slope because even starting down that thing, all of a sudden, well, why not just keep changing and why not just keep changing? And then before you know it, and I've seen plays like this, I've been to them, and it's not just because. I may be familiar with the play from having worked on it, that I recognize the changes, but I'm sure an audience probably, even if they don't subconsciously, is hearing something like that doesn't quite make sense. A word that kind of pops out of the blue and sounds like it was, someone coined it yesterday may not play in the same way. But then again, there's "Let's Kill All the Lawyers." We go, Shakespeare wrote that? He wrote that exactly. So sometimes he startles us with his contemporariness. Too. So we just have to be careful. In general, I'd say stay away, do your best to clarify, judiciously edit, and look to keep the structural integrity of the poetic line is important as well. Sometimes it can't in terms of the way you cut it. But I think there are kind of better and worse ways of going about doing that. And too often, there was just a recent project on the part of Oregon Shakespeare Festival that started this project where they had 37 playwrights come in and do modern translations. I guess they thought of them as of his plays, in which the little I saw of them and read on the page and looked at a version of Macbeth was not to take any away from. There was a lot of good playwrights involved in that, but they were sad facsimiles of the real thing. So stick with the real thing, and you'll probably be okay. And do your best to help the audience with, I mean, no one needs a coney catching joke in the 21st century, which there are plenty in some of those plays. So maybe the red pencil is good for the coney catching jokes, but otherwise, much of what he has to say, a large percentage of it is still very, very relevant and resonant to us. So thank you for that question, Isabel. So, in the name of Jesu Christ, speak fewer. I'm sure we could all think of someone that we could apply that line to. I hope you're not talking about me because I'm kind of rattling on here on a weekly basis about that. Sometimes I feel that way. I think I know who you're talking about. Yes, you could yell that at your daily briefing today. So, in the name of Jesu Christ, speak fewer, especially if you're encouraging the ingestion of chemical disinfectant. Yes, Helena goes sends in a line right from King Lear, which is always apt, and whenever this play is played, and would certainly be done today. But every time I've ever seen it, there's a groan from the audience when they hear "'Tis the time's plague when madmen lead the blind," and that's Gloucester and Lear out on the heath. And I'm not sorry. I know it's not in Lear. I think it's Gloucester and Edgar at that point. "'Tis the time's plague when madmen lead the blind." Yeah, which is a ironic and really powerful. Is seen literally in that play, but of course the metaphorical resonance for us is for all time. And comment on the uh, paucity of leadership. Karen at JMW says JMW students have some more. Oh, these are from students. Great. Oh, swear not by the moon, the inconstant moon that monthly changes in her circled orb, lest that thy love prove likewise variable, which of course is Romeo and Juliet in the balcony scene, right? Juliet is up there and she says, don't swear. He's going to say, I swear I love you. I swear I love you. And she says, don't swear because that all changes and oaths go away. It's got to be beyond swearing love. It's easy to swear anything. It's easy to swear your allegiance and then kind of betray. Love has to be more powerful. It's an incredible line. Um, Peter says he reads King Lear aloud to himself, and I couldn't stop bawling. I agree. Yeah, I was actually reading yesterday. I was reading the reconciliation scene with Cordelia, and it's hard to kind of utter a line, even in your head or out loud, without having a viscerally emotional reaction to that. I think it's the most moving play, as I said earlier, and I think that is probably the most moving scene in all of dramatic literature, certainly maybe in all of art. If you haven't read King Lear in a while or seen it, there's a lot of good versions out there, even film versions of it, and that particular scene there's actually a wonderful version of that you might be able to find on YouTube. I saw it years ago of Vanessa Redgrave and her father before he died in the backyard at their house. He's in a and they do that scene together just for themselves, and it's a kind of short little film version. It's very moving. The reconciliation scene in the French camp, of course, before Cordelia is killed. Um, Yes, Helena, that is perfect. The time's plague when madmen lead the blind. Peter asks, would you consider having actors use thick Rhode Island accents in a Shakespeare play? I think it might work well, especially for comedies. What a great question, Peter, because that's something that I think has been changing a lot. And I grew up and studying Shakespeare, kind of with the kind of icons of great Shakespearean acting. For me, were the generation that kind of came right after Olivier and Gielgud and those guys, right? Who were Olivier and Gielgud were still around, but who were taught by them, but also then brought in a kind of had that kind of incredible technique that was so often stressed in British training in terms of the use of the language, pitch, etc., and the technical prowess with the verse. And married to, they also grew up watching Brando and De Niro and Pacino and Streep, and they grew up kind of American method acting in that generation too. And so they kind of had a great kind of combination of the two, which I think is the best possible thing. That you have incredibly solid, and one shouldn't go without the other. It's a false dichotomy to begin with, but that incredible, technique, vocal and physical technique, use of the language, and also capacity and transparency of emotional cost. Um, that goes along with it. That it's vibrant and alive and tough and and not precious or just vaguely poetic in any way, shape, or form, right? But there was also a received thing about the Shakespeare to be good. We often have this as Americans where we think it should be talked about in plummy accents. We've talked about this before, right? People go, "How come you're not using a British accent to do a Shakespeare play?" Now, their British writer wrote them. Some of them are set in Britain, most of them aren't. They're set all over the place. So the accents don't really matter. As I pointed out, I think last week someone asked about, have you ever heard or seen play in original pronunciation? And we talked about John Barton doing that, and that original pronunciation, meaning the sound of the actor in Shakespeare's day, wouldn't have sounded anything like we think about British actors today, right? Plummy kind of Oxbridge accents. It would have been something very different, a much rougher sound, yeah. And so what I think you're starting to see, that's been going on for quite a while, certainly in Britain, is when I've seen plays over there or seen them broadcast here. What's great with the big companies, the Royal Shakespeare Company, the National Theatre, is they're encouraging their actors to bring their own voices in. And that's not to say that the music can't exist, that the music of their regionalism can't still kind of lift the poetry. We don't want it to detract from the kind of lift of the speech, but that you'll hear, you're watching a production of, Henry IV, and Hotspur sounds like he comes from Northumberland, where his family is from, and then you have London accents, and you have all over. Of course, the British Isles has many, many, many dialects. It's not one kind of standard dialect. And the same is true, of course, as America. And so, I grew up in Rhode Island, and when I got to school to study acting, I didn't wasn't aware of my dialect, of my regionalism, right, of being from Rhode Island at all. And so someone said, "Well, you have an accent." I was like, "What are you talking about?" And I did that. "What are you talking about?" And so much of our training as actors is often to neutralize that dialect so that we don't get kind of pigeonholed in one place. But as always tell my students, that's not a moral judgment. That if you have a thick Rhode Island, say, accent, and we know in Rhode Island there are 50, 60, 100 accents. I sit around at Thanksgiving with my family, and there are 10 different accents at the table, right? And we all come from Rhode Island. Um, so that is to say that that they can be used. I think we have to be careful that unfortunately sometimes the audience will attach a certain kind of dialect to a certain level of sometimes intelligence. um, that if you have a thick kind of urban accent, whether it's Rhode Island accent or it's a New York accent or a Boston accent, right? That somehow that means something about your intelligence. That's the way it plays story. Now that's not true at all, right? It's the same thing with the Southern dialect. Oftentimes, if someone wants to play, if it's a Northerner being prejudiced and they want to kind of do a stupid guy voice, they go into they go into a kind of like a dumb Southern guy to say this is a person without intelligence. That's completely untrue. As a matter of fact, to the most beautiful music in American English is in Southern dialects. In just the kind of the mellifluity, the sonority, the kind of the pitch, the changes, the music of Southern dialects is gorgeous, right? Think Mississippi Delta. Think there's so many of them, right? And so we'll often different parts of the country we associate that with like the level of intelligence, which is ridiculous. So you've got to be careful. And I think sometimes, yes, with comic characters, you certainly could. Oftentimes in Shakespeare, the upper class characters, the more well heeled characters, speak in a kind of in verse, and it's often with a kind of more well heeled or sophisticated dialect. And then you have the clowns who are speaking in prose, often in a kind of lower, kind of working person's dialect, if you will, kind of often you'll hear kind of Cockney London or something like that. So I think you can, and I think we're getting a little bit more forgiving of our prejudices about that, and I think that's exciting because I love to hear the different music of different people's voices on stage, and that there isn't only one way of being an intelligent character. That Hamlet can still be an intelligent and a prince-like character, and not speak as if he grew up with a silver spoon firmly implanted in his soft palate. Yeah. Um, Karen, back to Karen says, "Doubt thou the stars are fire, doubt that the sun doth move, doubt truth to be a liar, but never doubt I love." That's Hamlet's short poem he writes to Ophelia, who of course gives that to her father when he says you can't be around him anymore, and they use it as proof of his impending kind of madness. I always love that speech, and I think sometimes it gets overlooked in the play because I always thought it was a secret code that he's sending to her in a sense. Not, maybe secret code is too much, but in the middle of all of this crazy stuff, he says this thing about this machine is to him, and all the language sounds like he's crazy, and admits that craziness. He's saying, whatever happens, never doubt that I love you, and his hope for some kind of reconciliation on the other side of what he has set out to do. Of course, that never happens, and goodness knows, Ophelia can be forgiven for not being able to hold to this oath or even understanding it. But I always thought it was a plea from Hamlet to say, "I know that this is horrible and I'm acting horribly, but I have to." So doubt that the stars are fire, doubt that the sun doth move. Of course, it was a different way of looking at the universe. The sun doesn't, we move around the sun. Doubt truth to be a liar, but never doubt I love it. Heartbreaking. and sometimes gets missed in the middle of all of that cacophony around his action of going after his uncle. Um, Plumbed the accents. Love the description. Yeah, yeah. It's plummy, and plumbed. That's from Richard, who knows his way around that particular word. Karen, again, I do love nothing in the world so well as you is not that strange. Oh, it's Benedict. I love nothing. He, with when he finally admits his love to, and he's able to say it out loud to what the audience is way ahead of him. We know he loves her deeply in Much Ado. He and Beatrice. But that's such a beautiful way to put it. I do love nothing in the world so well as you is not that strange. He has to deflect right after it. He can't believe it came out of himself, and that yet he's been very brave and risked some of himself to even say the word "I love you." I love you is such a hard thing to say, and that it's expressed so beautifully in that kind of return and that second clause in that. Yeah. Um, Peter asked, great point about the accent giving a false level of intelligence. I read Lear on my own thick accent and it sounded right to me. Absolutely. Yeah. There's music in all of our voices and we should never lose that or kind of ascribe it that someone else's, especially, it's maybe it's my own kind of class rage, but it drives me a little bonkers to think that that we can attribute that that it's somehow a level of sophistication to the sound of your voice. We know that not to be true. And we shouldn't be reinforcing that in the theater. So I'm welcoming this kind of new music that we're hearing with regionalism making its way onto the stage and not one way of speaking. And perhaps that's a way of, the kind of sign of our global times that we're much more connected than we ever thought. Um, uh, Karen says her favorite is she pined in thought and with a green and yellow melancholy. She sat like patience on a monument, smiling at grief. Was this not love indeed? Oh, was not this love indeed? That's from Twelfth Night, of course, Viola, which Karen Carpenter played beautifully on our stage. So I don't know how long ago now. God, all the years are running together, but it's one of the first Shakespeare's, the second Shakespeare I think we did in our Pawtucket space, and of course the Great Twelfth Night. She smiled like patience on a monument, or she smiled. What is it? She sat like patience on a monument, smiling at grief. She's of course talking about herself in the guise of her sister. She's Violet at that point is disguised as Cesario, who is a servant to the Duke, and she's of course in love with him. Beautiful, beautiful scene. Act two, scene four, really the kind of center of that play and the hinge of so much of its emotional power. Do you think Shakespeare's lost plays will ever be found? This is Caroline. There's a bunch of plays that have been found. For those of you who follow this sort of thing, beside the kind of canonical plays that have come down to us over the last few centuries, there's been a lot of recent discoveries. There's an Edward III that some scholars attribute to him. Some say was written in concert with some other writers. There's a Cardenio, which kind of goes in and out depending on who you're talking to. Two Noble Kinsmen was kind of late added, and that there's some that would make it 38 if you include that. So there's a lot of things. I don't know that there was many other lost plays. I think that unlike we're missing so much of the Greeks, for instance, right? I think we have one I don't even know how we have so little of what actually we know that, for instance, like Aristophanes wrote, I don't know, dozens in plays or something, and we've got like four or five or six or something like that. So much was lost in the sacking and the burn, and all these kind of wars that were libraries were, oftentimes and you go to the library and destroy a culture's knowledge of itself, right? So that's a talk about a weapon of mass destruction, and we lose that forever to history. But I don't think we're missing all that much of Shakespeare. We have quite a lot from him, and so like I said, almost 900,000 words. That's a lot from any writer. If I were to pick up my find my complete works, it's like it's 3,000 pages of small print. He's left us quite a bit. Um, uh, I do love to hear a person's regional accent. Me too. Isn't the music of people's lives is so great? And if we all sounded the same, how Jesus, how boring, 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 boring. So to come back to favorite quotes, we got a few more that in here that I thought, yeah, that the better part of valor is discretion. Henry IV, to thine own self be true. All that glitters is not gold, he says glisters. Friends, Romans, countrymen, nothing will come of nothing, which is, of course, King Lear, which we're going to talk about in a second. The course of true love never did run smooth. Lord, what fools these mortals be. Cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war, which is from Caesar. There is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. From Hamlet, a horse, my kingdom for a horse. Richard III, there are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy. Of course, that's Hamlet as well. The fault, Dear Brutus lies not within our stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings from Julius Caesar. Yeah, I mean, it goes, shall I compare thee to a summer's day, which is from one of the sonnets. Here's the one that we always hear at the weddings: let not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments, right? How many weddings have you been in when it's that in the Second Corinthians, or what is the, what do you call it, 2 Corinthians? 2 Corinthians walked into a bar. Peter says, your 2018 version of As You Like It was my favorite of all versions everywhere, even the one I saw at the Globe last summer. Nora was incredible. Yes, wow, thank you very much. I agree. Nora was incredible. Nora's incredible. Nora Eschenheimer, who played Rosalind in that, who, if it's able to go forward, will be on the Common this summer at with our friends at Commonwealth Shakespeare, playing Miranda in The Tempest, along with another very, very close friend and colleague, and great contributor to Gam Shakespeare over the years, Fred Sullivan Jr., who will be playing Stefano in that production. So keeping our fingers crossed that we get to go see, we can have the social distancing guidelines that allow us to go sit on a blanket somewhere apart from our friends, and hopefully commune under the stars and watch a great Shakespeare play sometime in July. So let's keep our fingers crossed from that. Caroline asked, would the Lost Greek plays have changed literary culture drastically if they had not been lost? I don't know. There's a lot that we have, and who knows what would have been out there that may have, changed the course of things. Where would we be without Shakespeare today? If we didn't have it, we wouldn't be able to know how it's influenced our culture, as we've seen from just talking today, how one writer, right, um, who's one writer, one artist's work can have such a profound effect, on the course of actual human events, in terms of, because we're talking about language now. We're talking about how writers and how artists influence the way we actually communicate. And of course, by naming ideas, we're actually building structures of how we think, for better and worse, right? And for any artist that like a Shakespeare, and like so many great artists, can have an influence on us that impactful. What would We don't even know what it would be without them. As I think I pointed out a couple of weeks ago, Anthony Burgess calls Hamlet the one play that the world could least afford to do without, right? And so, what if we didn't have Hamlet? Where would we be? Well, we wouldn't know. It's like saying, when we die, right? We don't know. So it doesn't really matter that our deaths, what we leave behind, are for other people. It's not for us, because we won't experience it. So it's a difficult question to ask. Um, a couple more of people that were sent in to me, of our favorite speeches, and one that is, I was struck by, and I wanted to read aloud because of its just pure aesthetic beauty and rhyme. Sometimes we talk about the content of a speech and how the content kind of weighs on us. It's my favorite speech because Connie sent in a speech from Midsummer Night's Dream, where Oberon gives instructions to Puck about a kind of trick he wants to play on Titania. And you probably have heard this before. It's very famous. Oberon says, I know a bank where the wild thyme blows, where oxlips and the nodding violet grows, quite o'er canopied with luscious woodbine, with sweet musk roses and with eglantine. There sleeps Titania, sometime of the night, lulled in these flowers with dances and delight. And there the snake throws her enameled skin, weed wide enough to wrap a fairy in, and with the juice of this I'll streak her eyes and make her full of hateful fantasies. Now, I don't know if fantasies would have rhymed at that time. Fantasize probably would change the meaning for us if we said it that way now. But isn't that wonderful? That's all end stopped rhyme. There's a lot of rhyme in Midsummer, and where not just the content of that, but just the sheer beauty, the sheer aesthetic beauty of the imagery, right? That's very heightened poetry, and talking about the natural world, which he described probably more beautiful. Some people say, who are your favorite nature writers? I got that question recently because about something, not germane to this, but and I thought, well, Shakespeare's the greatest nature writer, right? And there it is, right? Because his ability, he had a sense of the generative, meaning his kind of imagery always reached up, versus it kind of lying flat or lying of the earth. It was always kind of extending from himself and upwards, in his way of constantly the fertility of life, the fecundity of life. That spring was eternal in his plays, and that's such a beautiful. And just to hear it out loud, right, with those rhymes and those beautiful vowels, the alliteration, the assonance in that, yeah, it's a reminder, just on a purely formal level, that the music of Shakespeare can to move us to very, very great heights, and to great depth of emotion. We're almost at the end here, and I said I wanted to answer Kelly's question from last week. And this is guy one Gail is reminding me, Nora, who we were just talking about, who's a great friend and fellow artist and colleague, and was such a beautiful Rosalind, was nominated for an Elliot Norton Award, which is an award given throughout the Boston theater community for Best Actress in a play at a large company for her role as Imogen in last year's Cymbeline at Commonwealth. So congratulations, Nora, to that. And I'm sure you'll be seeing Nora back on our stage. I hope sometime very, very soon, as we all can get back together again. Who knows? But anyway, so Kelly asked me about that. As I said, what was your favorite quote? And so I went to King Lear, and as I was talking earlier with Peter was talking about him, and I thought that this would be a fitting one to end with. Um, Lear, if you don't know the story of Lear, we're going to talk more about this play very soon. The king, to give a little context, gives up his kingdom. He's at the end of his life. He's 80 years old, and he's splitting up. He's decided to retire, and he gives his he splits his kingdom up between. He wants to split it up between his three daughters, but he basically asks them to play a game of who loves me most, and that doesn't go over quite well with his youngest daughter, who is the most truth telling. And so he banishes her, banishes friends, and starts to fall apart mentally, based on his own selfishness. And of course, he has this great. It's a great tragedy, and he has this great recognition scene where he is exiled out and about, and he's kind of caught in the middle of kind of hurricane, for lack of a better term. He's very frail, um, and he's looking for shelter in the storm. And his wits. He keeps talking about his wits, losing his wits. And he meets uh, who he doesn't know at the time, but Edgar, who is disguised as a homeless person, who has, in order to save his own life, has gone out into the forest and has made himself to be up to like a patient from Bedlam, someone who is dealing with mental illness and who has nothing, who is almost naked and is trying to survive on his shattered wits alone. And seeing this version of man, of what we are. Um, and trying to kind of shelter from the storm, Lear has this incredible moment of recognition in the middle of all of this, where he says, "Poor naked wretches, wheresoe'er you are, that bide the pelting of this pitiless storm, how short shall your houseless heads and unfed sides, your looped and windowed raggedness, defend you from seasons such as these? Oh, I have ta'en too little care of this. Take physic, pomp, expose thyself to feel what wretches feel, that thou mayst shake the superflux to them and show the heavens more just." So there's a lot to unpack in that, and I think we're going to talk about King Lear next week on Friday. But I wanted to leave you with that because it felt like a good thing to think about. Um, it's dreary outside today. We kind of had a dreary April, had decent weather-wise in February and March, and it came to bite us in the butt now. And obviously, circumstances in life for a lot of us are a little dreary right now. And I've tried to end this, and I hope this is a fun thing for us to think about, talk about great art in the middle of all of this. But great art also reminds us of our connection to each other and what we owe each other. And when we look around, a lot of people suffering right now, and as much as we all are, there are always people who are kind of even in more dire circumstances. Um, and Lear recognizes something that I hope we kind of don't forget in the middle of all this as we contemplate our own hardships. Um, that um, that we should always think of the people that ultimately there but for the grace of, like we say, go I. And as we're seeing now, there's a it's not hard to see the pain and the suffering that people are feeling out there. So reach out to them if you can, if you have the ability to help. You should help. That we should shape the superflux, the extra, whatever we have, to those who don't, because that is what justice. That is the essential definition of justice, not just from the heavens, but from, more importantly, in humankind. So be kind, love each other. Thank you for tuning in. We'll be back next week. I think we're going to talk about King Lear. Um, and so there'll be more on that next Friday at 12. Meanwhile, I hope you have a great weekend and be safe and be well.